My name's Andy Ross, and before I became a psychologist, I was a career teacher. And before I left, I was a head of year in a comprehensive in inner London. So I had pastoral responsibility for quite a lot of youngsters. There was a school psychological service stroke child guidance clinic down the road at Brixton, but we never actually referred anybody there because the wisdom amongst us was, what's the point? You wait a long time, you get a report back ages after they've seen the young person in school and done a test with them. You learn nothing more than what you actually told the psychologist in the first place, and you get an IQ score, and then nothing happens. So, like all teachers, we fell back on our own resources. And at that time, and I'm going back to the late 60s and early 70s, there wasn't a lot of recognition of special needs. And there was streaming in comps, and the kids who got difficulties, whether it was curricular or behavioural or emotional, they tended to go into the lower streams. I was also a tutor to a lower stream class group. And I was very much aware of the difficulties that we weren't tackling. And a lot of the kids in the lower groups shouldn't have been there. They had much more about them. They should have been stretched in a different peer group. If you've got to segregate people into abilities and potential, which is what the system was then. Anyway, at the same time as teaching, I was doing a psychology degree, and I got rather taken with it and decided I'd go and get trained to be an EP. 1975, I joined Nottinghamshire County Council as a very new trainee EP. But in my heart and hearts, I was actually still a teacher. I wasn't enamoured by IQ tests or psychometrics, even having learned quite a lot about them over my psychology training. And I knew that they were particularly limited. However, when I joined Nottingham, it was, here's your copy of your, I think it was a stamp of Binet or a whisk or something. And here's your patch, here's your caseload, get off and do it. I mean, the good news for me was that in 1981, we had the first bit of special education legislation on the back of Mary Warnock's review, and that was about, that introduced the statements, which were the forerunner to the EHCPs. And the statements were talking about a whole lot of dimensions of child development and performance. And it was about specifying how the child learnt and what they needed in order to make progress. And that gave us it gave me a feeling of confidence when I was talking to head teachers and talking about inclusion, that I could actually refer to the legislation in terms of, and we've got to do quite a lot of stuff. It's not about saying, well, this child's not up to matching, you know, coping with an ordinary standard delivery of a curriculum. We've got to actually do something to help this child learn. So I could be a bit more forceful, and it also meant that I could demand more of the schools in terms of their time. So if it wasn't about saying, I'm going to recommend your child goes to a special school because I think that curriculum would suit them better. Remember, that was a valid argument at that time because you didn't have a national curriculum, there wasn't such a thing as differentiation, and some of the special schools were extremely good. We've never knocked special schools in Nottinghamshire or anywhere else, right? So it was a very bold question. There are some children who were rightly in the special school and benefiting. And the mainstream teachers had this fantasy that, you know, this child isn't doing very well with us. He'd have people he could perhaps relate better to in a special school, and the curriculum would be geared to his or her aptitudes. And they were wanting it with the best possible reasons, not to get rid of the child. So for those schools who had that attitude, we could say, look, the legislation says there are very few children, like 5%, who should have a statement. And a lot of them will need to go to a special school to get the deal that they need. But the rest of them, yes, they've got learning difficulties, but they should be in mainstream. So that was the script we were using from 81, which was really great. And of course, I think we took it on board quite well within Nottinghamshire.
So when I joined Nottinghamshire Service in 1989, the service was at a point of change. So they just appointed a new principal psychologist, Tony Descent, and a new assistant education director, Peter Housden. And it came on the back of a critical report into Nottinghamshire's special educational needs practice, particularly around the previous process that they used for identifying children with special educational needs. And Nottinghamshire was seen as a non-inclusive local authority. And one of the things that Tony did when he came in was saying that he determined that he wanted to make Nottinghamshire an inclusive local authority. As the principal psychologist, the Educational Psychology Service was seen as the champions of that initiative. And it came at the time of the changes to the creation of the statement process as it was then. So I arrived where there was that process of change, and I would say that we had, I think at that time there might have been 6 or 7 senior educational psychologists, and each of them led a team. And I would say that they were fairly autonomous, those teams. But there was a variability in practice between the senior psychologists. So there were 3 senior psychologists who were either new to the service or who had principled, whichever you call it, principled or maverick approaches to special educational needs. And I think that you will have interviewed Andy as one of those, and he was my senior educational psychologist. 2 others, there was Mary Collins, who then later became the principal for Doncaster and Sheffield, and Colin Newton, who became the principal for the city when the city separated from the county. And I think it's relevant. There was that change within the special educational needs policy, and that those senior educational psychologists, they started to have greater sway in the way that people thought about the way that psychologists did their work. But it was against the backdrop of us wanting to become much more inclusive. At that time in 89, I would say that the majority of practice was still using intelligence tests. But there were particular people, including Mary, who were already at that point saying, I won't touch them at all. I won't use them at all. And so there was and I would say that my experience joining Andy's team was that I was given an awful lot of leeway in terms of what the practice that I had, and it was against the context also of us being encouraged to talk to each other about our work. So I had shared a room with a psychologist, and she would often mentor me and talk to me about the work I was doing.
Real change in Nottinghamshire happened when we had a new principal. The old one retired, and we had Tony Descent, if I can mention names, came in, and he just published a book called Making Mainstream Schools Special, or Making Normal Schools Special. I can't remember the exact title. But he was, again, it was on the back of the worn-up stuff. It was, look, if we're going to keep kids in mainstream school, we've got to give special skills and reset expectations, develop different ways of reaching children, and working out what the barriers to learning are. So we got a whole new language introduced from the legislation from Tony Descent, and he reorganised the service. And at that time we had a drive which was the Children First initiative, which was the whole of the Nottinghamshire County Council. And that was because we were filling up our special schools and expanding. We said, no, let's use the legislation, let's put money in, let's put training in, and let's stop this leakage from mainstream, because it's counter to the legislation and it's not necessary. We can do better than that. So we had a whole, it wasn't just an EPS initiative or an SBS initiative at the time, it was a county initiative, and we absolutely ran with it. The other thing that Tony did was to introduce protected time for R&D for every psychologist. So the seniors, I think there were 6 of us, we were seniors who managed an R&D project. It was only half a day a week, and every member of the service was assigned to one of the teams, and they crossed areas. So this was before city-county split. So, yeah, only just. Anyway, people moved areas even within the county. So I was a senior in Mansfield, and I might have in my R&D team 6 psychologists, maybe one from Rushcliffe, one from Bassetlaw, one from Newark, a couple maybe from Ashfield, my own team. So we got people with different views, because Nottingham's a very different county in different parts. And our remit was to work out ways of delivering to schools as a service, so the sorts of things we were offering, so develop our own skills and what's needed, to research what's needed. But as inclusion moved forward, it was about evaluating the effects of the Children First initiative and us promoting mainstreaming, to see whether or not how that was doing in terms of the children's progress, their happiness, their social inclusion, what teachers felt about it, what TAs who were supporting the kids felt about it, what parents felt about it. And we did, good psychological research. Obviously there were no control groups. We weren't looking to compare special with mainstream. We were looking at the efficacy of our new way of working, the advice we were giving, and the training we were giving, and to see whether or not we got a lot of unhappy and cross customers out there, or whether people were saying, yeah, we didn't think we could do it, but actually now we are doing it, it's absolutely great. And we published that, and we sent it to the Director of Education, and we put it into journals occasionally as well. Now, by this time, nobody was even asking or thinking about IQ tests. IQ tests are a casualty, if you like, of inclusion. They just became redundant, and they were the worst way of collecting information that was useful to promote inclusion. So if we were seriously into inclusion, which we were in Nottinghamshire, then there was no space for IQs, and it would have done damage, because people have just looked at the number again. Reductionist, reduce a child to a number. No, this child's an individual. This child has strengths or multiple intelligences. There are things you can do. You can do this, this, and this, and these people can help, and I can give you some training on that. That's where the conversation had to be, and where it was for lots of years. So it's an interesting journey.
So I came to Nottinghamshire with a hope to change, but knowing I certainly couldn't do it on my own, and knowing that this is what we did, this is what psychologists do. And if we didn't do psychometrics, what on earth were we, what good were we for? What were we going to do? So I carried on with the tests, as did everybody in the service, but we began to have conversations, and I realized there were people who thought like I did in the service. I can't remember exactly when we changed, but I did start using the tests less frequently. They didn't seem to be the answer to every question that was asked. So I started being a bit braver in what I did. But I was interested that for years I carried on carrying around the psychometric box, even though it no longer had the tests in it. I would carry that in because I thought I have to give the impression I'm doing something special when I see a young person. So I carried that with me. And then I think it just got to the point where we would have conversations about it. And I think that's one of the things we're really good at in NOTS, in that we get together, we all share ideas, we all pool everything, and we have a real good think about what we stand for, what are our values, what's the psychology we're using. And this was one of those points where we did it. And we've done it every few years since, and I just think it's one of the bravest things we do, and change comes out of it. And we just reached a point where, as a service, the majority of people were going, we need to do this differently. I know some people weren't comfortable with it. If that's what you've grown up with, that's what you do, that's what you're about. it's a difficult thing to change, but there were enough of us where we thought we can do something differently. So at that point, we agreed we would stop using tests where we could. And we, at the same time, maybe a little bit after, we had Patsy Wagner came and talked to us about a consultation model. And that became something that we were really keen to follow. And I remember one of the sentences she gave us was just, our language shapes our reality. And I realized how much power we as psychologists have, and how much we can use that to good, and how much we can really support the people we're working with. But that language, the power it brings, means we have to be particularly careful with what we're saying about children, because it feels like privileged information. People accord us that power and that courtesy. So we wanted to move forward to a place where we were listening to the people who know the child best, so parents, teachers, the young people themselves, and we wanted to find a way to work together. So we were supporting people who had this valuable, precious knowledge, and we could support them then to find the best way forward together.
Another significant piece of work which the service did at the time was the service had what was called research and development groups, which were the forerunner of what we have in the service now as groups of psychologists coming together to do a piece of, how do we say, project work. And one of those pieces of research and development I was involved with was writing a policy on the use of on dyslexia. So what would dyslexia assessment mean? And that was another piece of work which brought to the fore the debate about the usefulness or otherwise of intelligence tests. And of course, we were writing this policy in the climate of there being a sort of a bipolar debate going on around some who were saying that defining dyslexia required an intelligence test, and others who were saying the research says that in fact there is no evidence of a differential benefit in terms of the programs that you use for a youngster who scores highly on an intelligence test as opposed to lowly on an intelligence test. So that was another strand of work which led us to talk more about the use of psychometrics within the service. Another area was as those of us who were choosing not to use psychometrics, we had to develop our practice in other ways. And we needed to do it in a way that was defensive. I remember at one point I think it might have been Andy who invoked what was known as the Bolam test, which is a medical defense, which is that you can defend your practice if you can talk about or refer to a significant body of other professionals who would use the practice that you do. And that sort of elevated the need to talk to each other about our practices, and then to try to codify what we thought. So one of the pieces of work which I did in preparation for a later tribunal was I referred to a book called IQ in Question. It was 1997, Michael Howe's book, and used that to prepare a defense in terms of why intelligence tests should be questioned. We took an approach which was not about banning them. And I think that, for example, Mary Collins, the senior, she notoriously put all the intelligence tests in a cupboard and said, if you want them, if you want to use one, then come and explain to me and justify why your practice in terms of being able to use it, which was a powerful way of doing that. And that sort of continued within the service. We still, to this day, don't ban people from using them. But we have the standard about saying people should always be able to justify the practice that they have, and we recognise as well. We refer to the Bolam test and say, look, if you want to be able to defend your practice, including at tribunals, then you need to be able to. You're in a safer position if you're amongst other professionals who behave in their professional way, in the way that you do.